Okay, hi there. Welcome to the second in our series of updated videos looking at the economics of inflation and deflation. This time we're going to spend a few minutes thinking about some of the key causes of inflation. Quick reminder that inflation is defined as a sustained rise in a country's general price level. On average, the prices of goods and services are rising over time. And the inflation rate, of course, is the 12-month percentage change in prices. Now, when we think about what are the main causes of inflation, it's probably worth taking a step back to consider that most inflation comes from increases in the prices that businesses set and or that governments set for different goods and services. Consumers don't ordinarily choose to pay more for something, so the underlying causes are really driven by the decisions of businesses and government. And there are many causes of inflation, some of which are external to the economy. They come from outside as part of big factors happening in the world economy. Some of them are domestic. They emerge from within the domestic circular flow of economic activity. Some of them are caused by higher demand, some of them caused by decreased supply. So, for example, here are 6 underlying causes of inflation. There could be a money and credit boom. There could be higher wage costs in the labour market. The cost of your energy, your electricity and gas could be rising, and other utility bills. The exchange rate might be falling. We're going to talk about that in this video. That can be a cause of inflation. And so too the decisions of government. For example, what percentage rate do they apply to things like customs duties, tariffs and VAT? And more generally, we expect to see inflationary pressures pick up when an economy is experiencing, perhaps enjoying, rapid sustained growth. Now, there are 2 main types or causes of inflation that I want to focus on in this video, and they are cost push and demand pull. So first of all, what do we mean by cost push inflation? Well, that happens when businesses respond to an increase in their unit costs by lifting their prices, by raising their menu prices and other prices. And they're doing that because their costs are going up and they need to protect their operating profit margins. Now, cost push inflation can arise from both domestic and external sources, including, and this is critical for many countries, if the external value of their exchange rate, their currency, goes down. We call that a currency depreciation, because that then leads to an increase in the prices of the goods and services they have to import, particularly if their currency falls against the US dollar, since many commodities in the world economy are priced in dollars. So what are some examples of causes of cost push inflation? Well, cost push inflation happens when we experience rising prices due to higher costs of production. And so a good example would be labour costs going up. Perhaps unions have bidded wages up, or perhaps the government's announced an increase in the minimum wage. Oftentimes, cost push inflation comes from the higher prices of raw materials and other components globally that we have to import. So if one thinks about the price of copper or zinc or coffee or cocoa, if those prices go up in the world economy, then you may well import some cost push inflation into your economic system. A depreciation in the external value of the exchange rate, a fall in the currency, can also lead to cost push inflation because it increases the prices you have to pay to import goods and services. And the government could also be a catalyst for cost push inflation if they increase indirect taxes, high VAT, for example, which is a tax on businesses, or perhaps increasing or extending environmental taxes, considering, for example, the introduction of a carbon tax on CO2 emissions. So how can we show cost push inflation using aggregate demand and supply analysis? Key analysis to be able to use. Well, cost push inflation is caused by any factor that leads to an inward shift in the short run aggregate supply. So here's our equilibrium at Y1 and GPL1. If there's an inward shift of supply to SRAS2, for example, caused by higher cost of raw materials, that will drive the general price level up and lead to a potential contraction in the level of real national output. So there is cost push inflation. The inward shift of aggregate supply can lead to lower growth, and it drives up the general price level. Keep in mind, of course, that those factors may well be temporary. Often the case that prices go up and down in the world economy, and so the inflation rate may stabilise as a result. The second main cause we're going to focus on in this session is demand pull inflation. Now, demand pull inflation is a phase of accelerating inflation. The rate of change of prices is going up, and typically it comes from a rapid, fast growth in aggregate demand. So demand pull inflation tends to happen when perhaps economic growth is too fast. The economy is booming, output demand is booming, and businesses can then take advantage of that by raising their profits, raising their prices to widen their profit margins. So typically demand pull inflation is when businesses can increase their prices in order to make higher profits. And again, how can we show demand pull inflation using our analysis diagrams? Well, here we go. Demand pull inflation occurs when the economy is operating above potential, when there is a positive output gap and aggregate demand is rising quickly. So, for example, that would be a big increase in aggregate demand to AD2. Of course, that can lead to a short-term expansion of production, but it can also lead to higher prices and an increase in inflation. Demand pull inflation tends to happen when the short-run level of production is fairly inelastic, supply is inelastic, and the economy is coming up against capacity constraints. So demand pull inflation occurs when aggregate demand for goods and services exceeds supply. Typically, we tend to find it as a country approaches full employment or full capacity. Shortages of key materials drive up those prices. Shortages of skilled labour might increase wages. It's becoming harder for businesses to expand production, and therefore demand pull inflation is more likely, not inevitable, but it's more likely when there's a highly positive output gap where actual GDP is bigger than potential. And this usually occurs in the boom phase of an economic cycle. Actually, we can show both on the same diagram. This will be a terrific analysis diagram to show two causes of inflation. So cost push inflation caused by rising supply costs, and demand pull inflation shown by a shift in aggregate demand. When you're drawing diagrams for your assessments, make them nice and big, really clear. Here we have two causes of inflation driving the price level up.